Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutskaya, your podcast host. Alongside our regular series exploring horror film history, occasionally I'm granted time with some of the most exciting genre filmmakers right now to talk about the films that they've got coming up. I was a huge fan of Rose Glass's debut, Saint Maud. You can find a myriad of content on the main feed of the podcast about that film. And her follow-up feature, the 1980s set gym noir Love Lies Bleeding, was one of my most anticipated films of the year. Spoiler alert, it did not disappoint. I was lucky enough to sit down with Rose to chat about the making of the film, co-writing it with Weronika Tofilska, gym culture, and working with a stacked cast, including Kristen Stewart, Ed Harris, Jenna Malone, Dave Franco, as well as newcomer Katie O'Brien. Our conversation about Love Lies Bleeding, which is out in UK cinemas now, is completely spoiler-free until the very, very end, but you'll get a fair warning in case you have not yet seen the film, and if you haven't, what are you doing? There's a bank holiday weekend. Fix it. If you want more conversation about the film, do head over to our Patreon, which I'll link in the show notes, where author Julia Armfield and I go into the many glorious and gory pleasures of Love Lies Bleeding in great detail. With all of that said, please enjoy my conversation with Rose Glass. Rose.
Anna.
I've seen you so many times
I know.
now. I was like, what else? How have you been?
Yeah, good.
What's for lunch?
Same old.
So I wanted to ask you about gyms.
Yes.
Because there's such a particular ecosystem of pressures, of aesthetics, of bodies.
Yeah.
Is there something about the gym that was particularly interesting for you to make a film set in that world?
Yes, actually. And yeah, I think as you were saying it, I did remember that I'm not an avid gym goer. I tend to probably like many people go in and out of phases of okay, I'm going to go. And then you're like, fuck it and put it off. But I do remember, I think actually when I was writing Saint Maud even, I was going to the gym a lot then. And there was something about the kind of endorphins or the kind of rush that you get when you're doing exercise in a gym or listening to loud music or something, which was this kind of euphoric ecstasy kind of feeling, which I think at the time I was in my head, I was well, this is basically what Maud's all about in a way, is sort of chasing that kind of buzz. And so then I started coming up with the idea for Love Lies Bleeding whilst I was in post-production for Saint Maud. So I think in my head, there was always that kind of connection between what the characters were sort of after. It's in each character's case, they go about it in really different ways, but it's people trying to, transform themselves, yes, but also essentially to just try and get this sort of transcendent kind of feeling of euphoria, I suppose. Which and I guess I like that about gyms as well, is you kind of, the idea that if you look around, probably, most people are plugged into headphones, it's a big communal space, but probably everybody's there just completely in their own little world, in something, in what feels like a very mundane environment, but probably in each each person's private little brain, they're kind of buzzing, or experiencing something that's quite extreme and sort of exhilarating. So I don't know, it's a weird, exciting environment.
No, I completely get it. It's one of the reasons why I fell in love with gym going as well in the last couple of years, because I go there and I look at people and what are you thinking about right now? And also the routines that people develop when they go to the gym fascinate me. Someone will always come in with a little Pret latte and use the latte to mark their spot in the gym.
Oh, yeah.
I love that person.
I've joined a gym recently near me, just one of those pure gyms, the sort of ones that are open 24 hours a day. And I don't often go late in the evening, but occasionally it's quite interesting seeing the different sort of crowds. I'd be curious to see what kind of times of day people go. If are there people who are there at 3 a.m. and stuff, I guess, or people getting off night shifts. But there is this sort of slight, and we tried to sort of get this kind of feeling across in the opening of Love Lies Bleeding, which sort of starts up in the sky and then, the camera kind of goes down through the whole gym. But it was sort of this idea of the gym being almost this weird kind of temple, or this sort of place that people almost come to kind of, there's a slightly sort of worshipy sort of thing. People come there to try and improve themselves and better themselves.
It's like a church in a way.
Yeah, exactly that kind of thing.
And particularly with the film set in the late 80s, there's things, that we have now, kind of the way that we'll have the noise cancelling headphones, we're all separating ourselves even when we're going to a communal third space. How did you want to approach visualizing that kind of body obsession or like self-improvement obsession, particularly with Jackie?
Well, I guess it's sort of inherent just in how Katie/Jackie looks in that world. Like she's sort of wherever she goes. We kind of had her bundled up in costumes sometimes on the outside of the gym just to kind of go a bit more incognito. But she just is such a commanding sort of physical screen presence that you can sort of see the evidence of it. It was more like, I guess, showing the contrast between her in the gym where, as soon as she's kind of there in that environment, us like Lou, as soon as we see her across the gym, it's kind of like she's almost like this sort of like goddess kind of wandering around. And everyone's like, oh my God, who's that? But, then by contrast, one of the first scenes when we're introduced to her is like, that she's essentially homeless and like sleeping rough under a bridge. And so it was, I guess, sort of just evident from the character's life situation, we can see how sort of like powerful a presence she is in that gym versus on the outside, where she's kind of quite anonymous and, got quite a tough life. So I guess the implications of what she's chasing are evident in that, I guess.
Mm. And tell me a little bit more about the costume, because it's one of the things that sets us very firmly in the late 80s, sets us very firmly kind of in this very dusty, sweaty American environment. How did you work with your costume designer, Olga, on creating these two very distinct gym rat looks?
Olga Mill, our costume designer, I loved working with her. She's fantastic, and what else? She did Eileen recently as well, and before that she did like First Reformed and Hereditary, and she's a lot of fun to work with. But we kind of said from early on that we sort of wanted the characters' look to sort of be ones that you could easily dress up as yourself. Like if people wanted to go to a Halloween party dressed as Lou and Jackie, it should be like a kind of instantly recognizable sort of look, whilst also balancing that out with, obviously 80s is a hell of a notorious decade for fashion. And not my favorite, to be honest. And also it's a decade which has just been so kind of done in so many films. So it was sort of a fun challenge to figure out, particularly with Olga, but with a lot of other departments, how to kind of make it feel fresh and interesting and not just pastiche. So it was sort of, Olga asked me, she was kind of like, do these costumes scream or are they a whisper? And I think I said they talk confidently, so I'm not quite so that was kind of basically just not committing either way. But I guess Lou's look was sort of very, there's obviously something very kind of like androgynous about her, and we kind of thought that she would have sort of spent a long time cultivating like exactly her perfect, like, she kind of like wears sort of comfort clothes a lot more, but we sort of thought she'd have put a lot of effort into finding like exactly the t-shirt that fits just right and exactly the t-shirt of this band that you fucking haven't heard of and I have, kind of thing. Like her sort of comfort pieces. But she kind of also dresses a little bit more to be, she wouldn't say invisible. She's kind of like quietly sort of defiant, I think, in like her sort of like androgyny and queerness and how she sort of presents that. But I think there's still an element of, she's still in a small town in the 80s. So she's kind of slightly slips by fairly invisibly a lot of the time. Whereas Jackie, it's kind of a lot more kind of here I am. And so that kind of fun contrast between the two of them was good to play with, I guess.
And obviously the love between Lou and Jackie, their connection and their the way that their relationship unfolds, it's very overwhelming, but also very parasitic. And I'm wondering kind of what do you think Jackie represents for Lou and vice versa? Well,
I guess in some ways they sort of both have, they each have what the other wants in a way, like in the sense of, Lou's whole thing is that she's sort of been stuck in this town forever. All she does is bitch and moan about the place and her family, but never quite has the guts to actually like do anything. Her whole thing is she's sort of like almost embodies like inertia, whereas Jackie's all kind of like id and action. She kind of basically like sort of comes into town and sweeps Lou off her feet and basically sort of acts where Lou has always just been kind of paralyzed with indecision. And in terms of, and I think she's just literally never seen anyone like that before. I think, you know, on an immediate level, I think they both are just like incredibly attracted to each other, and just like there's something quite kind of primal about it. But just to like analyze it a bit more, probably Jackie in turn, I think, you know, I think in a way, the thing which sort of Lou hates, which is like her family and kind of been stuck in this place, arguably that's also the thing that sort of Jackie lacks, is like, you know, you can kind of piece together she's someone who's, you know, hitchhiked her way across the country, come from a fairly kind of like broken sort of like home life. Me and Katie always talked about her as being someone who had been very kind of like rejected by her own family and never basically had any place that she feels like she belongs. And so partly that's partly how and why she sort of channeled everything instead into this, pursuing her dream of being a bodybuilder, and, you know, even just making herself that physically sort of strong and sort of visible, I guess, probably comes from part of her which feels very invisible and disconnected from people. And Lou kind of it kind of gives her home, I guess, and a feeling of someone who really sees her and kind of worships her. So they do, I mean, initially, I think when they first meet, it is a much more kind of like practical sort of exchange, like, you know, Jackie needs a place to stay, like she has nowhere to live. And then they kind of both really fall for each other. But then, yeah, arguably Lou sort of, I think in earlier drafts, it was a bit more explicit how Lou was kind of manipulating or kind of pulling the strings to kind of get Jackie to sort of do what she actually needed to do herself, but couldn't. And now it sort of all happens a little bit more sneakily, but yeah.
And there's a lot of details that since I've watched the film, I keep thinking about it and remembering these little moments. Like both Jackie and Lou get called monster, I think, in the film by different people who are loved ones for them. Was that kind of a purposeful kind of monstrousness that you wanted to explore? And do you think that there's who do you think is a real monster in the film?
To be honest, I think when we were sort of like writing earlier drafts of it, and I think it'll get a bit, you know, it gets all a little bit more nuanced as the story sort of developed, but we were thinking of it more explicitly as like a Frankenstein kind of story, as in like, you know, one woman sort of almost creating somebody else into something that they then lose, somebody who they sort of create and have control over, but then lose control of that person or sort of get destroyed by their own creation kind of thing. So that aspect was definitely always there. And I suppose the idea of both of them feeling completely sort of like outsiders, and the sort of idea of, you know, mainstream society considering the other as monstrous, and both of them in different ways sort of embodying that kind of feel. Obviously, I don't think either of them are monsters literally, but who is the real monster? Like America. No.
Steroids.
Yeah, steroids. Even the steroids was initially meant to be, initially it wasn't literally steroids. It was more like some weird kind of made up drug. We had Lou as a drug dealer, and it was more this kind of surreal potion kind of thing. A whole kind of like mad doctor thing sort of got phased out. But
yeah, God, I kind of love that version as well.
There's all these things now. I'm like, oh yeah, we're going to do this and that. We had all these weird sort of like things. Like at one point, Lou's dad was going to be like a pig farmer, and then he was going to run a nightclub, and then we settled on a gun range. So it's a
gun range and Beatles.
Beatles, yeah, the Beatles kind of came in a bit last minute. I'm kind of like that. I think that's just, I like Beatles, so you know.
And there's also these wonderfully sparse but very operatic moments of violence.
Yeah.
And I remember the screening that I watched in, the women next to me were having very intense reactions and conversations with the screen to it. And I'm wondering kind of, what is your approach to showing gore or body horror? And did you have anyone tell you to pull it back in some of the moments in this film?
Not too much. I mean, I love it. That's all, you know, I've always liked gory, violent films, and it feels like some kind of fun release or something. Or, you know, I guess that's what I like about cinema, is you get to like vicariously live through other people and experience things, which in reality I'm sure would be deeply unpleasant. But, you know, from the safety of a cinema seat, it's all great fun. We didn't, did we get pushback on the violence? Not really. I think we got a bit of pushback on like the more just gross stuff. Like we've got, there was, I think we maybe had a couple more shots of Lou's arm down. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, Kristen's character, Lou, gets first introduced with her arm down a toilet because she, you know, works at this gym and one of the toilets is blocked. I think maybe we had like a few more graphic shots of arm down the very blocked toilet. And we had this great shot in the opening sequence of all these people in the gym, that opening one I was talking about. You know, we've got these very slow motion shots of different people working out and in their own little worlds. And we had this shot, which I loved, of a guy throwing up from exertion very operatically and in great slow motion, which I thought was great. But we did one test screening where we just got so many people being like, no. So I'd say arm down a toilet and throwing up guy was sort of the only bits that I think I cut just to appease anyone. But violence-wise, I think it's all there.
I love that people are more disturbed by someone throwing up.
Yeah, it was quite interesting.
Face being blown off.
Yeah. So that was all great fun. I mean, I think, you know, even just from the title, you know, the premise, it was always going to be a violent film, kind of gleefully so. So I think people were quite up for that.
And I want to talk briefly about kind of the body horror of it all, because it's very interesting, because it's very subtle. It comes in little bursts.
I'm like, is it subtle?
Subtle
until it's not. Yeah, exactly.
But specifically around Jackie, I think it goes hand in hand with bodybuilding or with any sort of athleticism or even dancing sometimes, when someone is using their body as their main tool and they have to constantly build it, adjust it, edit it in some ways. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you approached those scenes, particularly with Katie, obviously with her past as well, in that world? How much did you want to walk the line between surreal and the horrific, and just working with someone who's very used to maneuvering their body in that way?
I think just the fact of having a main character who is a bodybuilder, to me, automatically there's a really interesting, quite strange relationship with one's body, which just felt very natural to sort of lean into. Like, already I find bodybuilding quite a surreal sort of undertaking, mostly because, you know, you're kind of literally, I mean, I think, was it Arnie's talking about it in Pumping Iron? He's kind of like, my body is a sculpture, my muscles are the clay, like this kind of thing. So there's already this aspect. It's quite easy to think of it in quite slightly sculptural, slightly surreal sort of terms of like creating something new and kind of different. So to me, that all seemed to come, it felt very natural that it should sort of start to lead into showing it in slightly surreal ways, particularly because, you know, I was like in films where you're sort of getting across more you're more visualizing how something feels for a character rather than quite literally how it is. You know, and I think the idea of kind of characters getting bigger or having these kind of outbursts is like, there's quite a lot of examples of that in cinema, and, you know, like from Popeye to the Hulk or whatever. It's like there's a lineage of those kinds of characters, which I think we were quite keen to join with Jackie. I think it was always, and again, I think there were versions which were more explicitly surreal. Like, there's moments throughout the film as Jackie starts training and as she's falling in love with Lou, and it's like, is it love? Is it the steroids? Whatever. There are these kind of like heightened moments where we see her muscles sort of swelling. And those initially were going to be like, literally her arm was going to start glowing in a much more obviously magical kind of way, which just felt a bit distracting. Anyway, yeah. And in terms of doing it with Katie, I mean, yeah, the fact that she has, you know, actual competitive bodybuilding experience was super valuable. And definitely when we came to, I don't know, you know, even just, there's a lot of scenes in the script which are kind of like particularly montagey bits where it's like, we see Jackie working out, and, you know, I, you know, did research, but I'm obviously not a bodybuilder, not really a gym rat. So there's a lot of stuff which basically I was like, Katie, what would you be doing here at this point, do you think? And she'd be like, and she like knows exactly what, you know, she helped massively in bringing a degree of much needed realism to that aspect of the story.
And, you know, we've spoken about Katie and Lou, and their love and relationship is obviously the center of the film, but there's also this background of this array of very over the top,
colorful characters.
Yeah, colorful is a good word. Extreme is another. How important were all the supporting cast of personalities for you, and did you have particular fun writing or directing any particular one of them?
Yes, it was. I mean, just having this many characters was certainly new for me. Like, St. Maud is obviously very contained. A lot of scenes, it's just one person in a room. And I think probably it's something that wouldn't have happened had I been writing it by myself. I think just keeping that many moving parts in your head was a challenge, but doing it with Veronica, that was something I really enjoyed, was allowing it to kind of sprawl a little bit into this kind of, so there's like an element of the story which is a bit of like a family melodrama. And, you know, Lou's character, you know, her whole sort of like thing is that she's like stuck in this town, never left, and her family and the dynamics, she has various dynamics and feuds she's got going on with her sister, brother-in-law and dad, are sort of the things that she's always told herself are kind of holding her in place. And so naturally when she starts to sort of reach out of that, they all sort of start emerging, all those dynamics start bubbling to the surface to kind of like pull her back in. But it was, I mean, like the whole film is obviously quite heightened, and, you know, we enjoyed leaning into the sort of like campy aspects of it. But the hope was always that basically Lou and Jackie are very much like the spine of it. They're by far the most sort of fleshed out kind of characters, and a lot of the supporting ones were going to be a little bit more kind of, you know, orbiting them. And it was quite fun to sort of lean into the sort of heightenedness of each of them. I don't know. I particularly enjoyed we particularly enjoyed writing, and then I particularly enjoyed directing and everything. Any scene with Anna Baryshnikov in it, who plays Daisy, who's a kind of a sort of ex of Lou's, who's sort of still hopelessly in love with her and just keeps kind of, I think Lou just kind of like keeps her on the side and probably keeps leading her on, is probably like that sort of toxic person in Daisy's life who she like really needs to cut loose of, but just she can't quit her kind of thing. So I think Lou's kind of like stringing Daisy along a little bit. And again, it's just one of those other sort of like unhealthy comfort sort of relationships and things that she's got that's just kind of, you know, keeps her whole life sort of in stasis a bit. Anyway, Daisy's hilarious, and she's this kind of like, again, she was sort of like the antithesis for everything that Jackie becomes. So Jackie's kind of, you know, like action and kind of like health and exuding this kind of like physical strength. Daisy's like constantly chain smoking and eating sugary stuff. And we gave you know, gorgeous Anna these lovely horrible brown teeth, and she's just, at first you're kind of like, is this girl an idiot or an evil genius? And she's basically just, and Anna's just a really funny performer. So that was, yeah, she kind of started as like a tiny role, and then I think me and Vera just kept finding ways to sort of bring her back in. At one point she ends up being a witness to something she shouldn't have been, which then becomes a loose end that sort of needs tying up. And initially that was a different character who did that. But by that point we'd written one scene with Daisy and we're like, oh, maybe Daisy could come back. And Jenna Malone, who plays Beth, Lou's sister, who's in this very awful, abusive marriage with her husband, JJ, played by Dave Franco. Their dynamic's pretty awful. And again, becomes very relevant to the plot later on. I shouldn't go into any spoilers and stuff. But anyway, they're fantastic. I love working with all of them. Really great cast. Really lot of fun.
Really stacked cast.
Yeah.
Really must have been a bit daunting to have Jenna Malone, Ed Harris.
Yeah,
Kristen
Ed Harris
Stewart.
is a little bit daunting.
Imagine.
Yeah.
Especially once he puts that wig on.
Yeah, they were extensions he had
details.
glued in for the whole shoot. So even when we're kind of hanging out off set, he just looked like that the whole time. I think Dave, his character has like a little tiny baby mullet, and he works at the gun range that Lou Senior runs. So he's kind of, you know, his father-in-law is also his boss, and so we kind of like the idea that you know, Lou Senior obviously has these like long, luscious locks. So we thought maybe JJ should be like aspiring to be a bit like him. So he's sort of like trying to imitate him with his own little pathetic little baby mullet.
He's trying to get a mullet. I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
Aspiring to a full mullet.
Yeah.
And, you know, before I wrap up, I wanted to ask you in the most oblique way possible about the ending, which is, if not already, is going to be one of the most talked about elements of the film. Because
Yeah, it seems to divide people a bit.
Interesting. What have been the reactions to the ending that you've observed?
People seem to love it or hate it, frankly, or a bit which I sort of knew would be the case, but maybe the extent to which I've been a bit kind of like, or people seem to be more caught off guard by it than I thought they would, which I don't know what that says. So it's I'm like, oh, did I not see it? I don't know. Anyway, so that's you know, it was always going to be a strong flavor. It's one of the things I'm most proud of. So let's see what people think of it. I sort of feel I won't sort of say exactly. In a way, I'm kind of like, in a way, spoiling it before you go in maybe even helps. I don't know.
I think I need to put a little spoiler word in here just so I could hear your explanation for it. So I'll do a little audio.
Beep, beep, spoiler.
Spoiler.
Symmetry. The moment of a lifetime.
Fucking get it. Okay, so spoiler, they turn into giants at the end and run through the clouds, which felt to me and Veronica just like an incredibly like natural progression of events, believe it or not. So I think we wrote it in quite early on. So Lou goes to rescue Jackie from the clutches of her evil dad. And then after she's done that, she's like, okay, you know, wait for me here. I've got like unfinished business to attend to, and has this like final showdown with her dad, and gets herself into a very sticky situation. Her dad's got her, and then Jackie hears that she's in trouble and saves the day, simultaneously turning into a giant in order to do so. And then the two of them both turn into giants and run through the clouds happily ever after until Daisy, which to us just felt, again, it's sort of this kind of like emotional reality sort of thing. Like Jackie's whole sort of ambition throughout this whole thing has been allegorically or, you know, not thematically, in an abstract sense, to sort of turn herself into kind of like a hero or a god or an icon. That's kind of how I saw it, you know, speaking kind of like basically. But so the idea that it just felt like that's kind of how we should see that actually embodied physically. And I suppose the sort of the sensation of, in that moment, love conquering all, and the sort of like the heightened feelings of, you know, pulling through for the person that you love and seeing that person pull through for you, the kind of grandiose kind of emotions and soaring feelings that go along with that. Again, this kind of like endorphins, euphoric kind of feeling. It just felt like that was the way I really wanted to tell it. And like we wrote it fairly early on. I think kind of like in St. Maud, I kind of like knew how that was gonna, the very end of that, I had that ending there for quite a long time. And then a lot of the work is kind of figuring out how you get there. I think we kind of like had this for a while and figuring out how to get there. Although then at a certain point, I think me and Veronica both were like, maybe we can't do this. Maybe it's too much. So we then wrote several versions of it where she doesn't turn into a giant, and essentially still the same things happen kind of emotionally and sort of between the characters. It's just done in a grounded way. And it just felt a bit unsatisfying. So we were like, I really miss Giant Jackie. So Giant Jackie came back. We did used to have a few more shots where, because then, so I'm just waffling now, but like them running through the clouds, and you sort of see that Kristen's kind of transformed as well. And she's got her great little Lou version of like a Hulk costume of sort of like torn jeans and stuff. Anyway, we did have some more shots in that sequence where you like actually see Lou sort of grow. And then Jenna's character, Beth, the sister, we kind of had this great shot of her like looking out the window and seeing, and just her reaction of like, what the fuck? Which was like so wonderfully campy and over the top, which I kind of maybe wish we kept that in, but it was maybe a degree too silly. So this we thought was, you know, much more sensible.
I kind of love it because that's also the way that or someone like Jackie would see bodybuilders or even stars, exactly. You know, not just physically huge, but even the way that they're presented on billboards on a big screen, whatnot. They're these colossuses.
Yeah, absolutely.
And and I love that you're the kind. It strikes me as you're the kind of writer who starts with the ending, and then you have a very clear
like,
vision.
How do we get there?
Yeah, I love that. I relate to that. And just before we wrap up, now that we've kind of covered the ending, tell me a little bit about, you know, you were very confident about like, this is the only possible natural ending for these characters. What were people's reactions to that surprised you?
What, when it was in the script or like actually the finished film?
The finished film.
It's thrown people more than I expected. So again, maybe I was sort of like surprised by how caught off guard a lot of people seem to have been by it. To me, I kind of feel like, I feel like some people feel like the film's like played a lot more straight than it maybe is from earlier on. To me, it kind of seems quite kind of like that's the world that we're kind of in. But, you know, I don't know. I thought St. Maud was really funny and not many people agreed with me. So I'm like, maybe it's just a tasting. I'm like, yeah, well, come on. Obviously, this is the kind of world we're in where stuff like that can happen. I mean, there are sort of surreal things happening from earlier in the film, just maybe they're a bit sort of subtle and it kind of builds. But it's great to surprise people. It's wonderful watching that scene with an audience. I'm kind of like, in the room, it always feels like people really enjoy it. I think maybe people that just sort of, I think the idea of whether something's literally happening or not bothers a lot of audiences more than I think it should, I guess. Kind of like...
We're generally uncomfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah, I'm like, come on, guys. It feels good. Just go with it.
I mean, I'm mildly disturbed by the fact that you think that, say, Maud is a comedy of the way you made
it. Yeah, more of it's hilarious. Dark comedy.
Thank you so much for your time. I know we have to wrap up, but always a pleasure to chat to you.
You too. This was lovely. Thanks.